ACT exists with a different mission and a different purpose. We're not here to fight Labor and then babysit their policies. We are here to restore the values of personal freedom, personal responsibility, and private enterprise over state control that are the key to New Zealand's long-term prosperity. If you're not happy with the way that New Zealand is, the National Party have been in power for 47 of the last 74 years or something like that. So you can't be critical of New Zealand's current state without being critical of the National Party. And the reason I'm not a Nat and I'm in ACT is that I do think that the right needs to sometimes be prepared to actually push back and reform Labor policies, not just kind of bed them in. And New Zealand doesn't need more taxation. If you could tax your way to prosperity, then, Chairman Mao would have been a major success story, but he wasn't. In fact, no country has ever managed to tax its way to prosperity. So I think that ACT getting to 20% is realistic. And the same people who say it's not, remember they've got form having made the same doubtful predictions in 2020. We hear people's concerns and their hopes, and we put forward, often pretty detailed policy solutions. As the problems New Zealanders face mount up, and I think, based on New Zealanders saying we're going in the wrong direction by a ratio of 2-1 now, then I think that problem-solving approach becomes more appealing. New Zealand has to sort the meaning of the treaty within a liberal democratic society, and that means the next parliament is going to have to stop leaving it to the courts and the tribunal and the public sector who've run amok and actually define these so-called principles of the treaty that are now interspersed through just about every piece of legislation and public administration. And that means taking the treaty back to what it actually says. The government has the right to govern. People have the right to tiratanga or self-determination over their taonga or their property rights. And people have ngā tikanga katoa rite tahi, the same rights and duties. That has to be resolved, because we can't make progress in any other area when we're constantly arguing that there's two versions of humanity on these islands. It's just not true, it's not plausible, and it's never worked anywhere in the world. People are seeing whether or not you get into med school, whether or not you get put up the waiting list, whether or not you get certain pharmaceuticals, how your school is run, who you have to consult on resource management, who gets seats at the table governing Three Waters, who gets to be on the plant variety committee that registers IP for new plants. I mean, you name it, through every element of New Zealand society, this government is making your identity more important than your humanity. It is absolutely disastrous. What responsible politician would not be raising these issues in a constructive way that appeals to universal humanity and liberal democratic principles? That's what ACT's doing. It would be much worse if we were not raising these issues, and that is on the responsibility of the government. They are the one who are waging a culture war on New Zealand by trying to make identity more important than humanity. It's our duty to push back against that. I'll be judged on what we've actually done and said, which is relentlessly point out that universal human rights, liberal democratic ideals, one person, one vote, and we are all special because we're all human. And that comes before what used to be called bigotry and prejudice, judging people by their superficial characteristics. That's what we've said consistently. And we believe that to say anything else actually is racist. The Labor Party, who are just totally irresponsible, in order to get one more term in power, they will kick the can down the road on a long-term problem for New Zealand. And that's why I say ACT's the only party that is prepared to say things that are unpopular at times, but absolutely necessary. Once you start clearly identifying what the role of government is, then suddenly there's a lot less regulatory activity, and that requires a lot less consultants and public servants to administer and enforce this kind of thing. That would severely reduce the number of public servants, and that's what our alternative budget calls for. Restricting the level of legislative and regulatory intervention into people's lives will also lead to less demand for public servants and contractors, and ultimately save the taxpayer money in two ways. One, you don't have to pay people to interfere with you, and two, you don't get interfered with. Our alternative budget removes a number of ministries. One of them is the Ministry of Ethnic Communities, the Ministry for Pacific Affairs, the Ministry for Women, the Human Rights Commission. And I know that people will immediately see that as an attack on those demographics, but I would turn it around and ask, well, what has the Ministry of Women actually done for the average woman in New Zealand lately, a practical outcome or benefit that justifies the funding that goes into the Ministry of Women, which is tens of millions a year. And you just can't see it. They haven't done anything useful for a very long time. It's an insult to women, and you can make similar arguments around ethnic communities, Pacific affairs, Te Puni Kokiri, and so on. Every government department should be offering services that are accessible and suitable for every New Zealander. If they're doing that, you don't need these extra ministries. And if they're not doing that, you see that these ministries have failed anyway. In any event, they are absolutely pointless. And we could save tens of millions of dollars by getting rid of them. And I think that would leave New Zealand's taxpayers all the better off.